I picked up a 10-count pack of Oscar Mayer Classic Wieners from a cooler case last week. And right next to it, same shelf, same price range, sat a pack of Ballpark Classic hot dogs. Here is the first thing worth knowing before summer grilling season gets any further along. The first 2 ingredients on one of those labels are not a whole cut of meat at all. Read that again. By the end of this, I'm going to tell you the one pack in this lineup that earned a permanent spot in my own cart, and it is not the one most people reach for out of habit. Before I get into the labels, tell me something in the comments. Which of these do you buy most often? Oscar Mayer or Ballpark? And has it ever occurred to you to flip the pack over and actually read what is inside? Hot dogs are one of those foods most of us buy on autopilot. Nobody stands in the cooler aisle debating the merits of a Frank the way they might debate a bottle of olive oil. You grab the pack that is on sale, or the pack with the logo you grew up with, and you move on. That is exactly why this category rewards a closer look. The packaging on every one of these brands is designed to look almost identical. Red, blue, a grill graphic, a family having a good time. What is actually inside the casing tells a very different story from brand to brand, and most people never get past the front of the pack to find out. I think about this every time summer comes around, because a hot dog is one of the few foods that crosses every kind of household. It does not matter if you grew up with a garden out back or a corner store on the block. At some point in the warm months, somebody hands you a bun with a Frank in it, and you eat it without a second thought. That is not a criticism. It is just the nature of the food. But the fact that it crosses every kitchen is exactly why the label matters more here than it does for something more niche. A great many packs move off shelves every single week in this category alone, and most of them never get read past the front panel. This is what the ingredient list shows for Oscar Mayer Classic Wieners. The first 2 ingredients, the ones that make up the largest share of the product by weight, are mechanically separated chicken and mechanically separated turkey. Pork comes in third. Water and corn syrup follow, and then a list of preservation and texture agents. Sodium phosphate, potassium chloride, sodium diacetate, sodium benzoate, sodium ascorbate, and sodium nitrite. I read every word on the label. Here is what I noticed. Mechanically separated meat is not a cut you could point to on an animal. It is what remains after the bones have been stripped of the meat a butcher would normally leave behind, pressed through under pressure to reclaim anything still clinging to them. It is allowed. It is inspected. It is not hidden from you if you know to look for those 2 words. But when it sits in the first and second position on an ingredient list, ahead of the pork, that tells you plainly what the bulk of that hot dog actually is. That is not a filler in the traditional sense of breadcrumbs or soy. That is the meat itself, just not the part most people picture when they picture a hot dog. My mother kept a simple rule in her kitchen. If she could not tell you what an ingredient was, it did not come in the door. I did not always follow that rule once I was grown and shopping for myself and my own family, and I will say plainly that I bought this exact brand for years before I ever turned the pack over. It was familiar. It was inexpensive. I never once questioned it, because questioning it never occurred to me. That changed the day I started reading labels the way I am reading them for you right now. I remember standing in a kitchen that was not my own, helping put together a cookout for a family gathering, and somebody handed me a pack of these to boil. I flipped it over out of habit by then, the way I flip over almost everything now before it touches a pot of water. And I remember the quiet moment of just standing there, rereading the first line twice. Nobody else at that gathering thought twice about it. I did not say anything to anyone that day. I just quietly reached for a different pack the next time I did the shopping myself. So, here is my verdict on Mayer Classic Wieners. This is a hot dog built primarily from reclaimed poultry, stretched further with water and corn syrup, and held together with a working list of phosphates and preservatives. That is not a hot dog in the way a grandmother's recipe would recognize one. That is what is left over, engineered back into a familiar shape. Do you check what sits first on that list before it goes in your cart? Or do you trust the picture on the front, the way I used to? Now for the pack sitting right beside it in nearly every cooler case in the country. Ballpark Classic hot dogs list mechanically separated chicken as the very first ingredient, ahead of pork, ahead of water, ahead of everything else. After that comes corn syrup, potassium lactate, salt, sodium phosphate, natural flavor, beef stock, sodium diacetate, sodium erythorbate, maltodextrin, paprika extract, and sodium nitrite. Notice something interesting here. Beef stock shows up on this ingredient list, yet the dominant meat by weight is still mechanically separated chicken. That is worth sitting with for a moment. A hot dog can lean on the word beef in its flavoring and its marketing, while the actual bulk of the product, the thing making up most of every bite, is reclaimed poultry. Nothing about that is illegal, and nothing about it is hidden if you know where to look. It is printed right there in plain type. But the front of the package and the back of the package are telling two different stories, and only one of them is complete. I learned to judge food before I learned to judge anything else. That part of me never left, and it is the reason I cannot walk past a hot dog pack anymore without turning it over first, out of pure habit. My verdict on Ballpark is close to what I found with Mayer. A hot dog where the headline meat is not what fills most of the casing, propped up with maltodextrin for texture and a beef stock addition that does more for the name on the front than for what is actually inside. Zero surprises once you know what you are looking at, but very few people ever look. The word maltodextrin is worth pausing on for a moment, because it shows up on more labels than people realize once they start looking. It is a starch-based thickener, usually derived from corn, rice, or potato, used to carry flavor and hold texture together in processed foods. It is not dangerous on its own. It is simply another sign that a product needed engineering help to hold its shape and mouthfeel, the same way the corn syrup and the phosphates do. None of these ingredients individually is the problem. It is the accumulation of them, stacked one after another, standing in for what used to just be meat and time. Ask yourself this the next time you are standing in that cooler aisle. If a label needs 8 or 9 additives just to hold a shape and a flavor together, what does that tell you about how much of the actual product is doing the work on its own? That is not a rhetorical trick. It is the exact question I ask myself now every time I pick something up. Here is where I need to pause and give this channel a proper introduction. Because if you have made it this far, you are exactly the kind of person I am making these videos for. I am not here to tell you what to eat. I am here to tell you what is actually in the package, in plain language, so you can decide for yourself what belongs in your cart. If that is useful to you, this is where you follow along, because the rest of this list only gets more interesting from here. Now, I want to be fair about something before I move any further. Mechanically separated meat is a legal, inspected ingredient, and plenty of people eat these brands for years with no issue at all. I am not telling you these companies are lying to you or breaking any rule. I am telling you what the label says, plainly, so you can weigh it yourself. A hot dog does not have to be a health food to be worth understanding. Ingredient lists can change, and I want to say that clearly before we go any further. What I read off these particular packs is accurate as of when I picked them up, but manufacturers do reformulate. Regional distribution varies from one store to the next, and a supplier can shift without a single word of announcement on the front of the box. The only way to know what is actually in your specific pack, on your specific shelf, this week, is to turn it over and read it yourself. Do not take my word as a permanent verdict. Take it as a habit worth starting. Availability changes just as much as formulation does. A pack that sits on every shelf in one region might be harder to find in another, and a store-brand version of any of these 4 names might carry a slightly different list than the national version I am reading you today. I cannot account for every regional variation from where I am standing, and I would rather tell you that plainly than pretend I have checked every shelf in the country. What I can tell you is the method. First ingredient tells you the dominant component. The additive count tells you how much engineering went into holding it together. And the rest is yours to weigh for your own kitchen. Which brings me to the 2 packs that changed my mind about what a hot dog could actually be, once I started reading labels the way I read them now. Nathan's famous, all-natural, uncured beef franks list beef as the very first ingredient, followed by water, and then a short list you can actually picture in a kitchen. Salt, sugar, natural flavouring, dehydrated garlic, yeast extract, vinegar, sea salt, cultured celery juice, cherry powder, and paprika. That is the whole label. No mechanically separated anything. No maltodextrin. No corn syrup at all. What makes this one different is not just that beef sits first. It is that everything after it reads like something you would recognise from your own spice rack. Garlic, vinegar, paprika, celery. The nitrite here comes only from what occurs naturally in the celery juice and sea salt, not as a separately added chemical. I will not pretend that distinction erases every question people raise about cured meats in general, because that is a bigger conversation than 1 pack of hot dogs. But compared to the first 2 labels I read you, this is a shorter, plainer, more honest list from top to bottom. And it earns its place in my own pantry because of exactly that. Do you know the last time you actually finished reading one of these labels start to finish before putting the pack in your cart? Most people stop after the first ingredient. I used to as well, until I noticed how much the second and third ingredients on a label can quietly change the whole picture. I think back on my own pantry growing up, where a hot dog was almost never the star of a meal, more of a quick supper on a night when nobody had the time or the ingredients for anything more involved. Nobody in that kitchen ever discussed additives, because the words themselves were not printed the way they are printed now, in long chains of syllables most of us were never taught to sound out. Reading a label like this one, short enough that I can say the whole thing out loud in one breath, reminds me of exactly what a simple supper used to look like before ingredient lists got long enough to need their own glossary. Hebrew National Beef Franks are the other pack I keep coming back to. Kosher beef is listed first, ahead of water, followed by salt, spice, sodium lactate, paprika, hydrolyzed soy protein, garlic powder, sodium diacetate, sodium erythorbate, flavouring, and sodium nitrite. This one does carry an added sodium nitrite, unlike the Nathan's pack, And it does list hydrolyzed soy protein, which the Nathan's label does not contain. So this is not a perfectly clean label either, and I am not going to pretend it is. Here is my honest verdict on this one. The meat itself is beef, first on the list, with the kosher processing standard behind it. And the additive list beyond that is short and mostly recognizable, with the one exception of the soy protein, for anyone avoiding that ingredient specifically. This is a stronger pack than either of the first two I read you, even with an added nitrite on the label, because the meat itself is not stretched or reclaimed to begin with. That single fact changes everything else about how I read the rest of the ingredients. Now, I want to be fair a second time, because it would be too easy to end this list on a note that makes every added ingredient sound sinister. Sodium diacetate and sodium erythorbate are both common, well-studied additives used across the processed meat industry to control texture and stabilize color. And their presence on a label does not by itself make a product a poor choice. What I care about is the whole picture, added together, where the meat sits on the list, how many additives follow it, and whether the label reads like a recipe or like a chemistry set. This one reads closer to a recipe than either of the first two, even with its imperfections. Do you check for hydrolyzed soy protein specifically, the way some households have to for allergy reasons? Or is that a word you have walked past on 100 labels without ever clocking it? It is a small thing, but it is exactly the kind of detail that only shows up once you read past the first ingredient. There is a bigger principle sitting underneath everything I just read you. A hot dog brand can spend decades building a name people trust on sight, a jingle you can still hum, a mascot you remember from childhood. None of that tells you what is actually inside the casing. The only thing that tells you that is the list, printed in small type on the back, in the order the law actually requires. Heaviest ingredient first. Everything else is marketing sitting on top of a fact you can verify yourself in about 15 seconds in any grocery aisle. Before you go, I want you to do one thing. Whichever one of these 4 packs is already sitting in your own refrigerator right now, go pull it out and read me the first 2 ingredients in the comments. Not the front of the box, the actual list on the back. So here is where those 2 loops close. The number I mentioned at the start. 2 ingredients sitting ahead of any recognizable cut of meat on more than one of these labels. And neither one is something you would picture when you picture a hot dog. And the pack that earned a permanent place in my cart, the one I promised you at the start, it is Nathan's Famous, with Hebrew National close enough behind it that I keep both in rotation, depending on what is on sale that week. I haven't bought a jar of the cheaper stuff since I started reading labels properly, and I don't plan to start again.